It being 2 p.m, the time for members' statements has concluded. If members could just take their seats as quickly as possible. I inform the House of the death on 18 June 2021 of John Raymond Martyr, a member of this House for the division of Swan from 1975 until 1980 and a senator for the state of Western Australia from 1981 until 1983. As a mark of respect to the memory of John Martyr, I invite all present to rise in their places. I thank the House. And the Prime Minister on indulgence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On indulgence, I want to extend the country's congratulations and thanks to our Australian Olympic team as well as the organisers, Mr Speaker, of the Tokyo Olympic Games for what has been a truly extraordinary fortnight. These were the games that the world needed, Mr Speaker, and Japan and the Olympic movement delivered those games. These were the games that Australia needed, and our magnificent athletes have delivered. We've had wonderful Olympic Games before, Melbourne and Sydney, of course, on home soil, and Athens, Mr Speaker, amongst many others, but these games lifted us in a very different way at a very crucial time for our nation. The Australian Olympic team generally has inspired us. The Australian got it right with their headline, "Good Sports and Good at Sport." Achievement and character going hand in hand. The achievements are for the history books and they tell part of the story. 6 on the medal tally, 17 gold, 7 silver, 22 bronze, equaling with Athens our best ever gold medal tally. 99 individual members of the Australian team taking home medals across 15 sports and 20 disciplines. Olympic heroes and champions indeed for the ages. Chief amongst them, the mighty Emma McKeon, now atop the pantheon of Australian and world sport. 4 gold, 3 bronze, the most medals by an Australian at Olympic Games, and only the second woman in history to win that many. Now with more Olympic medals than any other Australian Olympian. Emma was joined in triumph by Kaylee McKeown and Ariarne Titmus, our queen machine of the pool. Kaylee with 3 gold medals and a bronze, inspired by the memory of her late father who she lost last year, and Ariarne with 2 golds, a silver and a bronze. I spoke to Ariarne and Emma's parents during the Games, and like all the families we saw during the Games, they were proud of their loved ones long before their Tokyo triumphs. The pride isn't in the medals, though the medals represent great achievement, but the pride is in seeing the emergence of such determination, dedication, discipline and sacrifice. We shouldn't be under any illusion. All of our athletes made great sacrifice in terms of their careers, their finances and studies to go to Tokyo. Sacrifices compounded by the delays and the restrictions of a gruelling pandemic, but they all found ways through to make their way to Tokyo. The gold medalists, Matthew Wern, Matthew Belcher and Will Ryan in the sailing, the paddlers Tom Green and John van der Westhuizen, and the incredible Jess Fox at her 3rd Olympics, Zach Stubbley-Cook and the women's relay teams in the swimming, Logan Martin in the inaugural freestyle BMX competition, and 18-year-old Keegan Palmer in skateboarding. And after 25 years without an awesome foursome, we ended up with 2 in one day, the men's and the women's fours. There were others, Mr Speaker, who moved us in ways, of course, we won't forget. Peter Boll, the 800-metre runner who expressed so passionately his love for this country and a truly great Australian story. Harry Garside, the boxer who learned ballet and won Australia's first medal in the sport in 33 years. And Skye Nicholson, devastated at her narrow loss in the quarterfinals of the women's boxing. We spoke on the phone. Skye said, "I'm so proud to be representing my beautiful country." I was in awe of what our athletes gave. Genevieve Gregson, ruptured her Achilles on the last hurdle of the steeplechase. It was her birthday. Jen described to all of us how to deal with setbacks, saying, "It's raw, it's hard, I'm not okay, yet I will be." Saya Sakabibara in the BMX was not competing just for her country. Saya was competing for her brother Kai, who was seriously injured whilst competing last year. In Saya's race, another competitor's bike touched her wheel and she crashed. She thought she'd let everyone down. But Kai put it best when he said, "Saya, I know this isn't what you wanted, but either way, I'm really proud. And let's go prepare for the next one." And we echo Kai's thoughts and words. We saw that resilience with Patrick Tiernan, giving his all in the 10,000 metres and pushing his way through every mental barrier. And there are others too who inspired us. Jean Feillet, a 6-time Olympian in table tennis. Andrew Hoy, who came back for his 8th Olympics, and at 62, and our oldest medalist yet, and an inspiration to many of us in this chamber, I suspect, Mr. Speaker. And we know there are the big things ahead for Rowan Browning and his mullet, Mr. Speaker, as well as our high jump silver medalist Nicola McDermott, who I spoke to today, with her remarkable sense of calm. All the teams, the Kookaburras, continued on their incredible journeys. The Matildas delivered their best performance yet, and the Boomers, led by the great leader Paddy Mills, brought us ever so closer to that Everest in men's basketball, and we have the foothold for it now as a result of his leadership. But for me, Mr. Speaker, the moment that really captured these games was the decathlon. The final event, the 1,500 metres, and 2 Australians, Ash Maloney and Cedric Doubler. Ash had the chance at a medal, Cedric didn't. So Cedric decided to back in his teammate. He was on his tail, pushing him on. We could see the intensity, and the lip readers could make out the words. And, Mr. Speaker, I don't think they were parliamentary. I'm sure the image of Ash and Cedric heading round the track will be iconic, Mr. Speaker. Cedric beckoning his teammate, "Keep going, go faster, give more, don't give up." That's the story of these games. Keep going, don't tire, don't give up, do what you have to do, focus on the finish line ahead. Mr. Speaker, the world owes a great debt to the government of Japan, the Olympic movement, and in particular to Prime Minister Suga and the Japanese people, who we commend for their great staging of these games. They persevered with these games, and they were vindicated. The critics said there would be no atmosphere. Instead, we rediscovered that sport isn't about the crowds, it's about the heart and soul of those who compete, which was on display. We saw that in the Tokyo Olympics, and we will see it now in the Paralympics, which we look forward to, which is now only weeks away, and we wish our Paralympian athletes all the same success that those who have already competed in the Tokyo Olympics have had. And there will be the stories there that echo these, Mr. Speaker. This is a country that celebrates, I think, the Paralympics like few others. And we stand our heroes of the Paralympics against and with all of our other great athletes in this nation, and we celebrate them with great pride, and we wish them all the best. The focus on the athletes is what we, of course, will take ahead as we move now to the Brisbane 2032 Games, which kicked off the Games for us, Mr. Speaker, and we commend all of those who have been involved in that endeavour. And I have no doubt, as kids pretended to swim in their living rooms watching the Olympics or doing high jumps over, as we saw last night, under a sack of pillows, Mr. Speaker, watching and thinking that it may well be them in 2032, and it's great that they now have that hope to look forward to. Mr. Speaker, I know that the character of the Australian Olympic team is shared by the Australians that they have represented. Australians have the grit, the determination and the character to prevail. There may not be gold medals, as I wrote recently, Mr. Speaker, for being a single parent, for running a small business, for doing the night shift in an emergency department or aged care facility, to be out there at the vaccination hubs, for volunteering for your local surf life-saving club or your local bushfire brigade, Mr. Speaker. But if there were, Australia would be at the top of the gold medal tally, I'm quite certain. And this is why I am so confident Australia will pull through this current challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. We won't let it beat us. We won't let our frustration get the better of us. We won't let negativity overwhelm our optimism. we will urge each other on, we will just put our head down and keep pressing on, and we will succeed. That is the Australian way.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. You've got to try and reach for the stars or try and achieve the unreachable. So said the great Cathy Freeman, who summed up the Olympic experience. These Olympics were a beacon of hope in a world where people needed something to smile and cheer about. And Australians certainly had full bottle on that. We saw so many young Australians reaching the unreachable in the past fortnight, so many who followed Cathy's path to personal triumph. I say to every one of our Olympians, you were selected with good reason, and when you got to Tokyo, you did our nation proud. You performed magnificently as athletes, as human beings, and as representatives of your country. What you gave us was demonstration after demonstration of everything that is great about the Olympics. We saw talent, we saw determination, we saw records broken, personal best beaten. We saw some dreams realised, some not quite. We saw physical and mental grit. We saw dignity and humility. We saw humour. And what it all added up to was true sportsmanships. Indeed, 17 gold medals, including Emma McKeon becoming our greatest Olympian. But some of the sweetest moments weren't ones of outright victory. The extraordinary story of Peter Bowl, once a refugee and an almost accidental athlete, running fourth in the 800 metres, he lifted all of Australia. Then there was, for me, something I'll never forget, the wonderful 10,000 metre runner, Patrick Tiernan. Him falling over about 100 metres or so from the finish line, getting up and making sure that he finished. Nothing left in the tank, but there he crossed the line. Paddy Mills and the Boomers showed us the sweetness of bronze. That wonderful interview that he gave after the game, where he said he looked forward to hanging his bronze medal at his mum and dad's, who've given up so much for him to make it. A proud Indigenous Australian who's never forgotten where he came from, and a proud ambassador for our nation as well as his people. And after that, the interview with Andrew Gaze on TV, him trying to hold back tears and then giving up. The wonderful exuberance of feeling quite rightly that he was a part of it, and indeed his dad, Lindsay, talking about when he began coaching when there were just 100 or 200 registered players in basketball throughout the whole of Australia, and how that sport has been built and how this bronze medal will help to build it even further in the future. Nicola McDermott soaring so magnificently to silver in the high jump. Her there writing in her diary after every jump so that she's got the contemporaneous notes there for the future. And Ash Maloney, of course, showing us what may be an amazing new dawn with his bronze in the decathlon, egged on by Cedric Dubler in that last 1,500 metres. What mateship, what commitment and goodwill. And behind all of these amazing athletes, we got glimpses of sacrifices made, of all the myriad costs of dedication. We saw the guidance of coaches and, above all, the love and support of families. Those broadcasts back to rooms in Australia, around the country, of people cheering on their loved ones. But from the bigger Australian family, may all of our Olympians feel our love, our support and our gratitude. Thanks for lifting us up. Thanks for your effort. Thanks for your achievement. Thanks also to those people in the administration, including the Australian administration, but of course the great John Coates, who's gone on to play an important role in the IOC and will always be seen quite rightly as an Australian representative. John, you are a good mate and you are a great Australian who has served your country and served sport well indeed. A big thanks as well to the government and the people of Japan for hosting these games. It was a big call to bring on the games and to maintain them, but you've done the world a big favour. We look forward to watching the Paralympics over coming weeks. Again, what is an incredible inspiration every time they are held, and we wish all of our athletes all the best in the coming weeks. I think that during a difficult time with most of Australia locked down, the TV ratings did pretty well. But it is something that at a very tough time for Australians, it gave all of Australia something to watch, something to smile about and something to cheer, and for that we thank you.
The Prime Minister with ministerial arrangements.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I inform the House that the Deputy Prime Minister will be absent for question time today, and for the remainder of the week the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia will answer questions on his behalf. The Minister for Defence will also be absent from question time today, and for the remainder of the week the Minister for Defence Industry will answer questions on his behalf in the defence portfolio. The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology will continue to be acting Leader of the House. The Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs will also be absent from the question time today and for the remainder of this week, and the Minister for Home Affairs will answer questions on his behalf.
Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister, and I refer to reports the government approached Tabcorp about conducting a lottery as an incentive for more Australians to get vaccinated against COVID. Are these reports correct? And will the government rule out economic incentives for vaccinations?
The
Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What we'll rule out is bad ideas, Mr Speaker. That's what we'll rule out.
Members on
We'll
both
rule out
sides.
bad ideas, Mr Speaker. And, of course, the government has got no issues with incentives, Mr Speaker. What we have a problem with is bad policy. That's the problem that we have, Mr Speaker. Bad policy. Paying $6 billion, Mr Speaker. Paying $6 billion, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Members on both sides, the Minister for Agriculture, the Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It goes to relevance. I'm quite happy to have a debate if the Prime Minister wants a debate about our ideas. This is about his idea for a lottery conducted by Tabcorp and whether the reports are correct and whether the government would rule out economic incentives for vaccinations.
Yes, I just say to the Prime Minister, it was a specific question that didn't ask for alternatives. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that we are not proceeding with any arrangement like that with Tabcorp, Mr Speaker. We're not proceeding with any such arrangement.
No, the Leader of the Opposition has asked his question. The Leader of the Opposition's asked his question. He's had his point of order. If he wants to ask other questions, he'll have to wait until the call alternates. The Prime Minister has the
Mr
call.
Speaker, the Operation COVID Shield has considered many types of incentives, Mr Speaker, particularly when we're in phase B of the program, not phase A of the program, Mr Speaker. But I tell you what we're not considering. We're not considering a cash splash. We're not considering splashing $6 billion to people who, by and large, have already had the vaccine, Mr Speaker. That is not the disciplined, informed approach the government is taking, Mr Speaker. That is the approach of the opposition, which has been rejected by the health professionals, Mr Speaker, as a cash splash, Mr Speaker. We will be not indulging the cash splash ideas of the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker.
The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on the Morrison government's national plan to chart our way back from COVID-19 and build a stronger economy?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Bass for her question and her leadership in her community, particularly as all members in this place seek to support those all around Australia who are either directly or indirectly impacted, indeed as they are, and the member for Bass's electorate because of the lockdowns in both New South Wales and in Victoria and the impact that it's having in Tasmania. Mr Speaker, the government has set out an agreed national plan to chart Australia's way out of this crisis and to ensure that we can live with the virus in the future. That plan has been set out and it focuses our efforts as a country forward. Each day we are taking a step further closer to that goal. Each day, Mr Speaker, we are getting further along this journey. And in fact, in the 7-day period, Mr Speaker, up until yesterday, at the end of Sunday,
Member
Mr
for
Speaker,
MacArthur, Member for Bruce.
1.3 million doses were delivered in a 1-week period. Mr Speaker, that is almost the population of the city of Adelaide in just 1 week. That is the rate of vaccination now being achieved in the national vaccination program, Mr Speaker, where we've overcome the challenge that we've had early in the program, turning the corner and ensure that Australians can move forward on the path ahead. The world is indeed dealing with the third wave of the Delta variant, and that has indeed changed the way that we have to address that at all levels within this country. And the success of regrettable but necessary measures that have been put in place by those states with lockdowns where outbreaks occur, Mr Speaker, are vital to ensuring that we enter the next phase at 70% vaccinated in the best possible shape, because the fewer cases we go into, Mr Speaker, in phase B, the better off we all are. And that's why those measures are so important, but they are assisted by the vaccine program, Mr Speaker, to ensure that New South Wales in particular can move through this current lockdown as quickly as it possibly can, but it must be effective. And that's why we have acted to ensure more vaccines, whether it be in New South Wales, whether it be in Victoria, or whether it be, Mr Speaker, in Queensland, where we've been able to work with each of those state and territory governments to provide hundreds of thousands of brought forward vaccines to support those states that have been dealing with those challenges. But that's backed up by the economic supports. Through the COVID disaster assistance payment, Mr Speaker, almost $2 billion, and indeed by now it would be above $2 billion, provided in direct economic supports to Australians who've lost hours in work because of these most recent lockdowns. And that is to almost 1 million Australians directly impacted with that support directly provided. And we continue to work with the states and territories who are delivering their business supports, and we're meeting those costs with them in those programs 50-50, shoulder to shoulder with the state and territory governments. 70% and 80% targets of vaccination double dose in this country are achievable, Mr Speaker. We are taking big steps towards that each and every day, and I thank Australians.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has repeatedly said the national vaccine rollout is not a race. How many Australians are in ICU today?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The current total in ICU for the whole of Australia is 70, Mr Speaker. 67 of those are in New South Wales. Mr Speaker, in addition to that, 30 lives have been lost this year to COVID, and 941 in total have been lost. And every single one of those deaths is a terrible tragedy for those families. It is a terrible tragedy. But we also know, Mr Speaker, that in this country, we have been able to prevent and avoid more than 30,000 deaths because of the collective actions of Australians in this country and the responses that have been put in place. Mr Speaker, overseas, people don't just know someone who might have had COVID, they know someone who's died of COVID. And in too many cases, they know of many people who have died of COVID. In this country, Mr Speaker, our experience has been very different. And it hasn't just been the saving of lives, which has been so paramount in our thinking as a government as we've responded, as we've continued to bring Australians together, indeed the states and territories together, as we have done throughout on over 50 occasions over the course of this pandemic. But it has also been about saving livelihoods. More than 30,000 lives saved and 1 million Australians back in jobs since last year's COVID recession, Mr Speaker. And Mr Speaker, at the end of these lockdowns, I know one thing will happen, and that is the Australian economy will surge back. And I know that because that is exactly what occurred after the last COVID recession, Mr Speaker, after the last impact. And indeed, we will see how things pan out over the months ahead. But I know this, the supports that we've put in to support the Australian economy, whether it was last year through JobKeeper, Mr Speaker, and the COVID supplement and the cash flow boost, and the many supports we put in place that saw the Australian economy through, ensured that we were one of the few countries in the world that had an economy larger on the other side of the pandemic than at the beginning, and more people in work, Mr Speaker, than before. And at the same time had prevented, through collective actions, 30,000 Australians at least not perishing, Mr Speaker, that puts Australia in a league amongst very few countries in the world today. It remains now for us to complete that job as we move towards the end of this year, and we see 70% of our country vaccinated, and hopefully 80%, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank Australians each and every day going out there and getting that vaccination as we hit, Mr Speaker, rates of vaccination which is up there with the world's best, Mr Speaker, as we are going through these most recent weeks. Amongst these most recent weeks, Mr Speaker, 1.3 million vaccinations in a 7-day period, Mr Speaker. That is where both the United States and the UK were operating per capita at a similar level, Mr Speaker. That is what our vaccination program is now achieving, and I thank Australians for supporting it.
And I call the member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House how the Morrison government's strong and cautious management in helping the Australian economy to continue managing the ongoing challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Wentworth for his question and acknowledge his strong and effective advocacy on behalf of small and medium-sized businesses right across his electorate. Mr Speaker, it's a very difficult time for Australians right now. We've got millions of people who are in lockdown in New South Wales and in Victoria, and indeed in Cairns today as well, Mr Speaker. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. The economy will bounce back as it has done so before. And we are there providing significant economic support in partnership with the state governments. We have announced income support for workers who have lost hours of work of between $450 or $750 a week, Mr Speaker. Around $2 billion has already been paid out to around 1 million Australians, including 700,000 Australians who reside in New South Wales. And today, legislation passed the Parliament to make those COVID disaster payments tax-free, Mr Speaker. Tax-free COVID disaster payments of $450 and $750. Now, there is also business support. And today, in partnership with the Marshall government, we announced a $40 million package, around $40 million of support for around 20,000 businesses in South Australia. Businesses in the tourism sector, businesses in the hospitality sector, businesses in the recreation sector in South Australia that will get economic support. And we've also reached an agreement with the Victorian government. We're providing hundreds of millions of dollars to businesses across that state. And in New South Wales, a 50-50 arrangement where businesses with a turnover of up to $250 million who have lost 30% or more of turnover, or seen a decline of 30% or more in turnover, will be eligible for payments of up to $100,000 a week, Mr Speaker. This is significant economic support, and this economic support will help Australian small and medium-sized businesses get to the other side. And we know that when we were facing an unemployment rate that could have reached as high as 15%, our economy bounced back, and today, in the most recent data, it was at 4.9%. And we heard from the Reserve Bank just last week in their statement of monetary policy that the recovery has been quicker and stronger, and that Australia's experience is that once restrictions are lifted, spending recovers strongly. And we've also heard from Standard & Poor's that, in its words, and I quote, it doesn't expect the current lockdowns across Australia to weigh heavily on the nation's AAA rating. Mr Speaker, we know our Australian economy is sound and will recover strongly.
Has concluded. And I'll give the call to the member for Greenway.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government announced aged care workers would be fully vaccinated by Easter. It's August. Less than half are fully vaccinated, and aged care facilities across Sydney are in lockdown. Will the Prime Minister take responsibility for failing to deliver on his announcement and vaccinate all aged care workers by now?
The Prime Minister, sorry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government's national vaccination program is the responsibility of the Prime Minister and Minister of Health and the government. We do take responsibility for rolling out the national vaccine program, Mr Speaker, and where there are challenges and there are faults, Mr Speaker, we correct them and we get on with fixing them, Mr Speaker, and that is exactly what the government is doing, and I'll ask the Minister for Health to add further to the answer.
Member for Shortland and the member for Lawler will cease interjecting. The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Greenway for her question. At this point in time, the latest advice that I have is that there are approximately 275,357 staff across aged care services. 257,143 vaccinations have been administered across those 275,000 staff. That includes 156,340, or 56.8% of first doses amongst those staff, 100,803, or 36.6% second doses. On the advice and discussions that I've had with Lieutenant General Fruin and his team, every facility in Australia is required to and does have a plan for vaccination. The range of options which have been developed with those facilities includes the following. Firstly, there is self-vaccination, where facilities are conducting that program as a form of in-reach. As a form of in-reach, that has been one of the most successful. The example being the TLC facility, with over a 90% success rate with both residents and with staff in Victoria across all of their different properties. The second thing as part of that is that we are expecting that there will be, over the next 2 weeks, over 30,000 staff who are completed through these variety of programs. That will also include in-reach through vaccination service providers, 6 principal vaccination service providers, and then thirdly, in-reach through general practices and what are called Commonwealth vaccination clinics. In addition to that, there is the outreach option of state vaccination clinics, of Commonwealth vaccination clinics, of general practices and of hubs. All of these things are coming together. In addition to that, one of the things which the Prime Minister was able to achieve through his work with National Cabinet was a commitment of National Cabinet for the states and territories to produce public health orders to mandate that anybody who wishes to work in an aged care facility will have to be vaccinated. It's an important initiative, and I thank the states and territories for their cooperation and in working with the Prime Minister to that outcome.
The member for Melbourne.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. The birthplace of democracy, Athens, is on fire, and so is the west coast of the United States. Europe is flooding, and here in Australia, our own bitter experience means we know the world is in a climate emergency. Tonight, the world scientists will release the latest IPCC report warning the world is heating faster than feared and that we may cross catastrophic tipping points from which there is no return and hit 1.5 degrees in just a few years. Prime Minister, your 2030 targets are a death sentence for our country. Will you heed this warning and join the US and the UK by at least doubling our 2030 climate targets? Or will you keep failing to protect Australia and its people from the climate crisis?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the government is seeking to achieve net zero emissions as soon as possible. That's what we're seeking to do, Mr Speaker, and we're seeking to do that by using technologies, not taxes. Mr Speaker, we are seeking to do that not by robbing the livelihoods of Australians around this country, Mr Speaker, and putting upon those, whether they be in the suburbs or the regional towns of this country, higher and higher costs of living, Mr Speaker. We're not going to be doing that to Australians. We are going to achieve this goal and address the real action needed for climate change, Mr Speaker, by ensuring that we're investing in the technology which is the game changer, and the game changer not just in this country, whether it's the hydrogen hubs or the many other initiatives, the $20 billion, Mr Speaker, and the technology roadmap, all of this designed to ensure that our economy transitions over the course of the next 30 years, Mr Speaker, to ensure it plays a highly successful role, not only ensuring we're addressing climate change, but at the same time ensuring that our economy is strong and successful, and particularly in regional areas of this country, Mr Speaker, they are not sacrificed at the altar, Mr Speaker, that they are being supported through the transition through the transition, Mr Speaker, to ensure that their initiatives and their efforts and their enterprises continue to be rewarded well into the future. But the member would be interested to know that Australia not only has this record, Mr Speaker, of investing in these new technologies, but also achieving our targets, having beat our Kyoto Tier targets by 459 million tonnes. Our emissions have fallen by 20% since 2005, far exceeding, Mr Speaker, those who come forward with big claims about what they may achieve in the future. Australia is achieving emissions reductions right now, 20% reduction in emissions since 2005. Mr Speaker, between 2005 and 19, the last year of comparable data, Australia reduced emissions faster than Canada, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, the United States and the G20 and OECD averages, Mr Speaker. Australia is performing. And there may be those in this place who want to talk Australia down, Mr Speaker. They want to talk Australia down about what we're achieving, but I can tell you the farmers of this country have been putting their shoulder to the wheel in this task, Mr Speaker. The resources industry is putting their shoulder to the wheel on this task, Mr Speaker, transforming their industries, and our government is backing them up. Because our government believes that you can get emissions down, you can keep electricity prices down, that you can address the future industrial needs of this country, Mr Speaker, and you can do that in a way that is complementary, and that you don't have to sacrifice one for the other. And I can tell you, Mr Speaker, our government will not go down the taxes route. We will not go down the taxes route, Mr Speaker. Those opposite might, we will not.
The member for Sturt has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please update the House on how Australia's COVID-19 vaccine program is reaching record numbers of Australians, including 1.3 million vaccinated last week?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Sturt for his advocacy and support and passion for vaccination and for all of the elements of the things which have kept Australians safe during the global pandemic. And the member's correct. Last week there were 1.33 million vaccinations in Australia. 1.33 million Australians, or almost the entire population of Adelaide, as the Prime Minister said, stepped forward to be vaccinated. It is, we believe, a record for vaccinations for any week, for any form of vaccine in Australian history. And that's a testimony to the work of Australians. It's a recognition of their commitment to the program, and it's a recognition that as the supply has increased, so has the capacity of Australians to receive those vaccines. And what that has shown is that they are stepping up, that they are passionate about being vaccinated. Around the world, we see the horrors of the pandemic every day. In the last day alone, over 470,000 cases and again over 8,000 lives lost. We're seeing these numbers grow again in another global wave of the pandemic driven by the Delta variant. Against that background, we know that Australia's not been immune, but that we have been overwhelmingly shielded from so much of the agony that has ravaged the world. As the Prime Minister mentioned, we now have 941 lives lost in Australia, but 30,000 lives have been saved against the OECD average. The things that we have done as a nation have been the rings of containment of borders, testing, tracing, distancing and vaccination. And right now, in terms of vaccination, we've reached 13.7 million total vaccinations, and that's over 9.1 million first vaccinations, and what we also see is 4.6 million second vaccinations. Indeed, what we've seen now is well over 7 million AstraZeneca vaccinations. I want to thank the member for MARIBYRNONG, who has been a very strong supporter of the AstraZeneca program. There are others who've taken different views. He's been a strong supporter of that program. And I want to thank all of those that have advocated for this vaccination program. What we are seeing now is that we have now passed 75% or 3/4 of the over 60s in this nation. We've now passed 81% of the over 70s in this nation, and these vaccinations are saving lives and protecting lives. There's more work to be done, but every week more Australians are stepping forward, and in that last week alone, a population almost the size of Adelaide has been vaccinated.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Maribyrnong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. The government announced, indeed promised, that every resident in disability care would be fully vaccinated by Easter. But as of last month, fewer than 1 in 5 residents in disability care were fully vaccinated. Will the Prime Minister take responsibility for failing to keep his promise to vaccinate all vulnerable residents in disability care by now?
Hear, hear.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Maribyrnong. At this point in time, we have had 17,311 disability residents on the latest advice that I received from the National Incident Centre shortly before coming to question time. That represents approximately 63.6% of residents. And in addition to that, the total residents who've received second doses is 12,132, or 44.5% of residents. What I particularly want to do is to encourage all of those residents, and in particular to encourage their friends and family to support them and to assist with making sure that there's consent, that there is agreement, that there's the confidence to accept that vaccination. That is an extremely important part that each and every one of us can play. In addition, with regards to the outreach program to ensure that we are working with those residents, what we have is a program for all of the facilities across Australia, over 6,000 in particular facilities to be visited. That program includes vaccination service providers, it includes GPs. We have lifted the Medicare rates for home visits. So these elements are in place. In addition, we are seeing the disability hubs play a very important role of providing a service where disability residents, their carers, the workers or their family are able to ensure that they are provided with that support. I would note one very important fact, and that is that the loss of life amongst disability residents in Australia is less than the average of the loss of life for all Australians. It has been one of our singular national achievements, and there are many, many people around Australia to be thanked for that. But for all of those carers, for all of those workers, for all of those who have assisted with the vaccination program, we want to thank them. And as the Prime Minister has reminded me, it's the same with Indigenous Australians, that these two groups that were part of our awareness right from the outset, disability and Indigenous Australians, have overwhelmingly been able to be kept safe, and these results have meant that those communities have been even more protected than the average in Australia, and that's something for which we are thankful and grateful.
The member for Nichols.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government's substantial investment in agriculture and innovation will boost jobs and prosperity in regional Australia and assist with the industry reaching its target of being a $100 billion industry by 2030?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Nichols for his question. He represents a very rich and proud agricultural area and makes a significant contribution to Australian agriculture, which is $66 billion. And that's been despite the droughts and the reduced flows down the Murray River that region has experienced. And that's why, because of the challenges we naturally face in Australian agriculture, we adopt technology, science and research quicker than nearly any other industry in the country, because we have to. And that's why, as part of the government's Ag 2030 plan, one of the key pillars, of the 7 key pillars that we're investing in to ensure we build resilience but also grow Australian agriculture and support the over 330,000 jobs that are in agriculture today, that we invest in innovation, the new pillar of Australian agriculture. And that's through some reforms of our 15 commodity research and development corporations, whether it be cotton, grains, dairy, in making sure we get back to first principles. Value to the levy payer, value to the taxpayer, removing the duplication of research across those organisations and commercialising, getting a rate of return on the investment of over $1.1 billion a year that the Australian taxpayer and farmers contribute to having the cutting-edge technology to give our farmers the tools they need to continue to grow agriculture. And that's also about supporting it in a digital sense. And I'm proud to say that we launched the Grow Ag website, and that's about bringing together all the research that these 15 research and development corporations are producing and making sure not only is there no duplication, but saying to the world the opportunities that are here in Australia. And already we are seeing international players wanting to partner with our research development corporations and investing in jobs here, in innovation, in agriculture. But we're also creating physical platforms, 8 drought innovation hubs, one of which is in Nichols at Dookie College. This is about making sure that we have investment of infrastructure out near our primary producers, so the extension and adoption of that technology will continue to be taken up, to ensure that also they are able to dictate the type of research that's important to them, not just for drought, but also through these research and development corporations, getting value for money for that $1.1 billion that is placed out there. But one of the things we haven't done well is the commercialisation of the best and brightest in this world. And that's why last week we announced grants of $34 million worth of programs to incentivise those ideas to go from ideas to actually adoption and commercialisation, to get a return that will be reinvested back into our most precious asset, our human capital that are out there in the new pillar of agriculture. This is about putting the environment around agriculture to continue to grow and to reach its goal of $100 billion by 2030.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the Prime Minister's October 2020 release of the 3-step framework for national reopening. The Prime Minister said then that Australia was on track to be open by Christmas last year. Now, with millions of Australians in lockdown, state borders closed and international travel suspended, does the Prime Minister take responsibility for telling Australians something that just wasn't true?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, on several occasions, we have worked together with the states and territories to combat COVID-19. And on each occasion, Mr Speaker, we have put forward plans in good faith and sought, Mr Speaker, together to achieve those plans. Now, that is the right thing to do, Mr Speaker. And as we struggled against that COVID-19 pandemic, we set out a program of restrictions that could be eased in different phases, Mr Speaker, as we struggled against the then known variants of the COVID-19 pandemic, Mr Speaker. But as we know, as the pandemic has progressed, new and different variants have emerged, Mr Speaker. These are things, Mr Speaker, that neither I, the Premiers, Mr Speaker, the Chief Ministers, indeed, in the great wisdom of the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, would not have been able to have the foresight to be able to know which turns the pandemic may take. Mr Speaker, there is no country in the world today that has been able to predict every movement in this pandemic, but it is the responsibility of government to respond to the circumstances that we face and to seek to provide a path out. Now, Mr Speaker, on occasions, the pandemic, the virus, gets the better of those plans. But, Mr Speaker, we will continue to make them and we'll continue to move towards them, Mr Speaker, and implement them, and we will encourage Australians to engage with us in that, Mr Speaker, so we can indeed chart our path out. And it may well be the case that further strains of this pandemic may impose further blows. But I tell you what, Australians will respond, Mr Speaker. They won't hope for the worst like the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, in this pandemic. They won't seek to take political opportunity of the pandemic, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Isaacs. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, point of order. On the dignity of the House, the Prime Minister should think about what he just said. Think about what he just accused members of the Parliament on the dignity of the House.
The
There's a concept called the dignity of the House. Are you aware of it?
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. I'll just say to the Prime Minister, he wasn't asked about an opposition policy. He was asked about the three-step plan. Up until that point, he had been relevant to the question. As I've said last week, when he's asked a question that doesn't ask about alternatives, that is quite specific in its nature, having answered it and having been very relevant to it, which he was up until that point, in the remaining time he does not have the option to simply launch a political attack. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker. So now the National Cabinet, under my leadership, has put together a national plan, Mr. Speaker. And the question is, Mr. Speaker, do those opposite support it? Do they support it, or will they seek to undermine it?
No, the Prime Minister.
I'm talking about our national plan, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, but no, the Prime Minister resumed his seat. You can talk about the national plan, but if you're going to insist on asking questions, I may well let them answer them. But that is not how question time works. You said you're seeking to talk about the national plan. You can do that. I am not going to keep making the same ruling and be ignored. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, the national plan, as set out, means that we get to phase B, where restrictions begin to ease, Mr. Speaker, at 70% vaccination rates. And at 80%, Mr. Speaker, we are able to live with the virus and the vaccination rates continue. Now, in no plan, Mr. Speaker, and in no scenario do we make the assumption that COVID is eliminated, that COVID somehow miraculously disappears from the planet. And we will need to have ways of continuing to manage that, even at those high vaccination rates, Mr. Speaker. But the plan we have set out is a plan that Australians can achieve. The plan that we have set out, Mr. Speaker, is a plan that Australians are daily achieving, Mr. Speaker. And we have set out that plan, and we have set out that pathway, Mr. Speaker, and Australians will come on that path with us, Mr. Speaker. Others may not wish to, but we will steadfastly go about that plan.
The Leader of the Opposition seeking to table a document.
Speaker, I seek leave to table the Prime Minister's three-step plan to sustain a COVID normal Australia. Step 3, COVID normal, granted. Target date, Christmas 2020.
Of the House.
Leave is not granted.
Leave is not granted. The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House of the Morrison government's success in delivering significant tax reform and how this is providing real tax cuts for Australian businesses, workers and their families? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for her question, acknowledge her experience as a law professor, a law dean and as a Vice-Chancellor of Notre Dame University, Mr. Speaker. And she's been a strong advocate for lower taxes, including 25,000 businesses across her electorate are eligible for the immediate expensing provisions, Mr. Speaker. And more than 50,000 taxpayers across her electorate are getting a tax cut as a result of policies that we on this side of the House have supported, Mr. Speaker. Now, we have put in place, we have legislated significant structural tax reform, including the abolition of a whole tax bracket, the 37 cents in the dollar tax bracket, to see people who earn between $45,000 and $200,000 pay a marginal rate of tax of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. Indeed, if you are a teacher earning $60,000 a year, you are paying $6,480 less tax this year as a result of our plan, Mr. Speaker. And if you are a truckie on $90,000 a year, you are paying $7,020 less tax this year over the course of the period, Mr. Speaker, that we have introduced these tax reforms. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've also put in place immediate expensing for businesses. We've also put in place the loss carryback measures. We've also put in place a patent box for businesses in the medical and biotech sector who can get a concessional company tax rate of 17 cents in the dollar. But I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? And we know that the member for Rankin and the member for McMahon hoodwinked the member for Maribyrnong at the last election and came up with $387 billion of higher taxes, Mr. Speaker. And then, as Australia was winning gold in the pool, they quietly dumped negative gearing, Mr Speaker, and also some of their other higher taxes. But no one believes them, Mr Speaker, and no one was prouder of those tax increases than the member for Rankin. But of course they also opposed our legislated Stage 3 tax cuts. And the member for Rankin called them offensive, Mr Speaker. He said they were the least fair, the least equitable, Mr Speaker, the least effective. So he went on Sky TV and he was asked by Kieran Gilbert, so you didn't get rolled on this particular issue, Mr Speaker? The member for Rankin. Of course not, Kieran. This is better. He said, in terms of Labor supporting our tax cuts, the member for Rankin said, this was my recommendation to the Shadow Cabinet, to the Expenditure Review Committee. In all the forums that I've participated in recent times, I've made it clear that it is my preference. This is in my portfolio and this is the recommendation I made to the colleagues. No one believes it.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Why does the Prime Minister constantly change his plans instead of delivering them? Last year it was reopening by Christmas and we're at the front of the queue. In June it was vaccine horizons. In early July it was a new deal with a 4-phase plan. 2 weeks ago it was a different 4-phase plan. And last week it was a fast-track vaccination policy 18 months into the pandemic. How many plans will the Prime Minister announce before he delivers one?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The objective of all of our government's efforts, Mr Speaker, the objective of all the plans that we have put forward, Mr Speaker, has had two objectives: to save lives and to save livelihoods, Mr Speaker. To save lives, and more than 30,000 lives have been saved as the result of the collective actions of Australians, Mr Speaker, and the actions of governments and the leadership of our government, Mr Speaker, and 1 million Australians have got back into work after last year's COVID-19 recession. Now, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party have put this to us. They've said to us, Mr Speaker, that why do things have to change, Mr Speaker? Well, he may be unaware that COVID-19 is a voracious virus, Mr Speaker, which sets its own rules. And what we have done as a country, what we have done as a government, have been responsive, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we can address the many challenges that have come from COVID-19 and do so as a federation, Mr Speaker, and do so in a way that has saved more than 30,000 lives and put 1 million people back into work, Mr Speaker. Now, the Leader of the Opposition may be disappointed with those outcomes. Mr Speaker, he may be.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business. Member for Franklin on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. There are a series of allegations you cannot make about other members of parliament. And what was just alleged by the Prime Minister should be completely outside debate in this House. Completely outside.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. I'm listening very carefully to the Prime Minister. I call the Prime Minister and I remind him of my rulings, which still stand.
So, Mr Speaker, Mr Speaker, will continue to do what is necessary to get Australians through this crisis, as we have from day one. From the day our government shut the borders, Mr Speaker, from the day, Mr Speaker, that we called the global pandemic 2 weeks before the World Health Organisation, Mr Speaker, all throughout this crisis, as we've brought Australians together, Mr Speaker, and ensured that more than 30,000 lives have been saved and 1 million Australians have been able to get back into work, Mr Speaker. That is the product of the efforts of Australians under the policies, under the leadership of this government, Mr Speaker, working together so closely with our states and territories through the Federation. That's what it's required, Mr Speaker, working together to get these results. And we've set out that plan, we've set out that pathway that requires us all to come together and achieve the 70% and 80% vaccination rates, which we are now approaching on, Mr Speaker, with great pace, as we've addressed the serious issues that we've had to overcome with the issues of supply and other medical advice, Mr Speaker, that have impacted the vaccination program. We are overcoming that and we have turned the corner, and Australia is on the path to living with this virus. And we will be on that path and achieving that, Mr Speaker, at the same time as ensuring that we have had one of the lowest fatality rates of COVID-19 in the world and one of the most successful economic records through the COVID-19 crisis, including, Mr Speaker, maintaining a AAA credit rating, Mr Speaker, despite the significant investments we have made to keep Australians in work and to keep Australia moving forward.
The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is working toward the goal of ending violence against women and their children?
The Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for her question and commend her for the work she does in her electorate of Chisholm, particularly around young women's leadership. The Morrison government is absolutely focused on making Australia a place that is free from violence against women and their children. We demonstrated our ongoing commitment to ending family and domestic violence in the 2021-22 budget, where we made the largest ever commitment to women's safety with a $1.1 billion package. And this work must continue. And it must continue with real recognition that home is not always a safe place to be, particularly in a global pandemic. Lockdowns and health orders across the country mean women and their families are facing new challenges. But a lockdown does not and should not ever mean that you cannot escape violence. This government, through our partnerships, is continuing to provide support to vulnerable families, including direct financial support. This year's budget included a new escaping violence payment, which will provide immediate financial assistance to support women leaving a violent relationship. There's also $12.6 million for additional projects under the Safe Places initiative to upgrade, purchase and make fit for purpose emergency accommodation for women and children. And, Mr Speaker, we will continue to focus on initiatives like Safe Places for regional and rural women, where there's often much less access to emergency accommodation and where it can be much harder to seek help in a community where everyone knows you and you know everyone. The upcoming Women's Safety Summit on the 6th and 7th of September is a very important event managed by the Minister for Women and the Minister for Women's Safety in the other place. It will be a critical step in developing the next national plan. The summit will provide us not only with an opportunity to shine a light on the terrible violence that women from all walks of life experience, but importantly a chance to listen to the victim survivors, the experts and those on the front line who face these awful challenges daily. The summit will discuss key issues for women's safety, including financial security, policing, the justice responses, sexual violence and the often unique challenges facing, for example, migrant communities and Indigenous Australians. The summit will put these voices on the national stage to ensure that these experiences contribute to what must be a comprehensive and effective national plan. The Morrison government and I know this whole parliament remains resolute in the task of ending violence against women and their children, no matter what form it takes, and through our budget package and through the next National Action Plan, we will all continue to work towards this goal.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his press conference on Thursday where he said 5 times in 50 seconds that ministers made the decisions on the commuter car parks program. If the minister was telling the truth last week, how does he explain the letters he signed on the 11th of January and the 10th of April 2019, in which he provided funding for 38 car park projects?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I confirm again what I said at the press conference the other day. It is quite normal, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister, through the hunting licence process that members opposite may be familiar with, through the RSC process, signs off on a whole range of recommendations that are made within their authority by ministers. That's the normal process, Mr Speaker. This program goes to something very important. This program that we have supported, Mr Speaker, and I'll quote you, someone who was very supportive of these projects. It says, public transport isn't just about the train line or the bus route itself. It's also about the surrounding infrastructure that makes it work for local residents. That is why we are committed to upgrading parking facilities here at Mango Hill Station and at the transport hubs across the country. That was from the member for Grainler, Mr Speaker. That was from the member for Grainler. The member for Grainler, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party comes into this place and seeks to deride a program that they themselves have supported. But I will ask, Mr Speaker, the Minister if he wishes to add to my answer.
The Minister has the call.
Well, I do thank the Prime Minister for the opportunity to add to the answer. And as the Prime Minister absolutely accurately said, there is a yawning paradox here. There is a yawning paradox because the Labor Party at the last election committed to a park and ride fund and committed to building commuter car parks at Mango Hill.
I'll just say to the Minister, the Prime Minister did briefly compare and contrast, well, compare, I should say, the policies, but the question didn't ask about alternatives, and in fact it didn't. Hang on, I don't even need supportive interjections. Okay, they're unhelpful too. It didn't even ask actually about the merits of spending money in a particular way. It specifically went to quotes of the Prime Minister's or the number of times he'd said something, and asked to explain how letters were signed off in a particular way. So it is very narrow. I'll call the Minister.
And Mr Speaker, what the Prime Minister has said is entirely consistent with what the Auditor-General's report has said, which makes it clear that the decisions made here are within the authority of the Minister and within the authority of the Commonwealth Government. Page 38 of the Auditor-General's report, under infrastructure investment program arrangements, the Australian Government may commit funding to an investment project at any time for any phase based on information it deems appropriate. So the decision of the Minister—
The Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On a point of order, on relevance, the question went to the Prime Minister signing letters on the 11th of January, 10th of April 2019, approving funding for 38 projects, and the contradiction with his comments last week, where he said 5 times
to the Leader of the Opposition,
that it wasn't his decision.
Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. I understand the point of order he's making. I believe the Prime Minister addressed that in his opening remarks. If nothing more can be said that's relevant to the question, I'll wrap it up and we'll move on to the next question. The Minister has the option. The Minister has.
The Minister chooses not to exercise the option.
The member for Higgins has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government has continued to protect the health of Australians throughout the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Higgins for her question and her service to the nation through her career both in the parliament but before the parliament. Importantly, we know that the pandemic has accelerated this year. Sometimes it's lost that there were approximately 80 million cases last year and over 120 million cases this year alone so far as part of a global pandemic. There were 1.8 million lives lost last year. There are nearly 2.5 million lives lost already this year. So that pandemic that so many had predicted would finish within 1 year has accelerated and expanded globally during the course of this second year. Against that background, what we have done is maintain and extend and expand our long-term national health plan. As part of that, of course, COVID protection has been fundamental, and I went through some of those elements earlier on. But critically, we have put in place arguably the most significant reform of Medicare since its formation with the creation of telehealth. Over 68 million consultations have now been carried out. That's had a profound effect in the delivery of health services around Australia, not just in response to COVID, but on an enduring basis. It has helped transform the way that health services will be provided to older Australians, to parents with young children, in particular to people in rural, remote and Indigenous Australia. But at the same time, one of the things we've also had to do is ensure powerful mental health supports. We've not seen an increase in the suicide rate despite predictions, and that's an immense national achievement. We've not seen a decrease in the suicide rate despite all efforts. So there's more work to be done on that front. But what we have done is put in place mental health support in the pandemic, which has inevitably saved lives and protected lives. That has been expanded just on the weekend with the extension of the Head to Help program in Victoria, the expansion of it to New South Wales with 10 new clinics, including 7 across Sydney and 3 across rural and regional New South Wales. But at the same time, we've expanded Medicare, going from $19 billion when we came in to $30, $31, $32 and $33 billion over the forward estimates. We've seen in the last year 30 million diagnostic services. We've seen well over 100 million pathology services that have all saved lives and protected lives, and expansion of the PBS with a new drug commencing on the 1st of August, Evrysdi for spinal muscular atrophy, which will give 100 children a chance at a better life, a longer life and a safer life. All of these things are saving lives.
And I call the member for Scullin.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Last month, the Audit Office gave evidence to the Parliament that your office was involved in a canvassing process to select commuter car park projects to fund, based on an initial list of 20 marginal Liberal-held seats. When will the Prime Minister actually explain his role in the process instead of having other ministers defend it for him?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In relation to the question just put by the members opposite previously, I directly addressed the issues that were being put before the House regarding, Mr Speaker, the role that the Prime Minister plays in finalising an expenditure review committee process, and that is exactly the role that I played, Mr Speaker. That is not an unusual process. It is a process followed by previous Prime Ministers, previous Labor Prime Ministers, previous Liberal Prime Ministers. Mr Speaker, that is the way that you finalise a budget round, Mr Speaker, when you go through an expenditure review committee process. Now, those opposite might be unfamiliar with that process. I'm not unfamiliar with it, Mr Speaker. Very familiar with the process of the economic management of this country, because, Mr Speaker, it has been under this government, when we went into this pandemic, that we had been in a position where we've been able to balance the budget so we could deliver, Mr Speaker, the single greatest economic response the country has ever required, Mr Speaker,
Prime Minister
and
Australia was there. The member for Scullin on a point of order. The member for Scullin on a point of order.
Thanks, Speaker. Relevance. I mean, this is a very interesting dissertation by the Prime Minister, but the question
Scullin will make his point of order.
Was a very narrow question about the process followed in this instance and the role of his office. He should come to those questions to be relevant to the question.
The Prime Minister does need to be relevant to the question. He has been up until now, but it's not an opportunity to speak about the economy or the budget generally. The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, so I can confirm that the matters were dealt with in accordance with the budget process and the authorities provided to ministers, Mr Speaker.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government continues to deliver on keeping Australia's borders secure and Australians safe, while planning for the reopening of borders when it's safe to do so?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
I thank the member for her question, and I thank her for the great work that she has done in her local community in the electorate of Moncrieff on the Gold Coast throughout the pandemic, where she has supported individuals, families and communities through this particularly difficult time. And of course, she has provided great support to our businesses. Now, At the start of the pandemic, our government acted very decisively on our international borders, and without a doubt, this has helped to spare us from the worst impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we now face a significant challenge. The Delta variant is one of the most significant challenges that we have had to face during this pandemic, not just here in Australia, but right across the world. And as we ramp up our vaccine delivery, we know that we have to remain vigilant. So while COVID-19 has certainly challenged all of us, Australia's travel exemption regime has kept us safe from widespread COVID transmission, and that's why our borders remain effectively closed. That being said, we can't seal ourselves off from the rest of the world. We need to bring vaccines in, we need to keep our postal links and our cargo links open, and we need skilled workers. And we need those skilled workers to support our industries here in Australia. And we know that whilst we have many skilled workers here, we still need to look at bringing more skilled workers in to supplement that workforce. Now, I do want to take this opportunity now to thank the Australian Border Force for the great work that they have done day after day. They have been particularly efficient at ensuring that the vital supplies like our Pfizer vaccines are expedited, and this has ensured that we've been able to ramp up the delivery of our vaccine strategy, with more than 1 million doses now being given every week. And several days last week, there were record numbers of vaccinations. And of course, our 4-stage plan, our national plan, has set out a pathway back to normal life. We want to make sure that Australians are able to travel as freely as they possibly can, and work is now well underway with the Australian Border Force, with the Australian Federal Police, and in fact supported by many of our industries right across Australia, to make sure that when it is appropriate and it is safe for us to open our borders, we will be in a position to do so. So I do thank those that have worked so hard during this pandemic to get us to the position where we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we are working towards that.
The Prime Minister.
I ask that further questions be placed on the notice board.
I thank the Prime Minister.